Hello, and welcome to a recording of Teddy, written by J.D. Salinger in 9 stories. I'll exquisite day you, buddy. If you don't get down off that bag this minute, and I mean it, Mr. McArdle said. He was speaking from the inside twin bed, the bed farther away from the porthole. Viciously, with more of a whimper than a sigh, he foot-pushed his top sheet clear off his ankles, as though any kind of coverlet was suddenly too much of his sunburned, defibrillated-looking body to bear. He was laying supine just in the trousers of his pajamas, a lighted cigarette in his right hand. His head was propped up just enough to rest uncomfortably but most muscatically against the very base of the headboard. His pillow and ashtray were both on the floor, between his and Mrs. McArdle's bed. Without raising his body, he reached out a nude, inflamed, pink, right arm and flicked his ashes in the general direction of the night table. "October, for God's sake," he said. "If this is October weather, give me August." He turned his head to the right again, towards Teddy, looking for trouble. "Come on," he said. "What the hell do you think I'm talking for? My health? Get down here, please." Teddy was standing on the broad side of a new-looking cowhide Gladstone, the better to see out of his parents' open porthole. He's wearing extremely dirty white ankle sneakers, no socks, seersucker shorts that were both too long for him, or at least too large, in the seat, an over-laundered t-shirt that had a hole the size of a dime in the right shoulder, and an incongruously handsome black alligator belt. He needed a haircut, especially at the nape of the neck, the worst way, as only a small boy with an almost full-grown head and a reed-like neck can need one. "Teddy, did you hear me?" Teddy was not leaning out of the open porthole quite so far or so precariously as small boys are apt to lean out of open portholes. Both his feet, in fact, were flat on the surface of the Gladstone, but neither was he disconcertingly well tipped. His face was considerably more outside than inside the cabin. Nonetheless, he was well within the hearing of his father's voice, that is, more singularly. Mr. McArdle played leading roles on no fewer than 3 daytime radio serials when he was in New York, and he had what might be called a third-class leading man speaking voice, narcissistically deep and resonant, functionally prepared at a moment's notice to outmail anyone in the same room with it, if necessary, even a small boy. When it was on vacation from its professional chores, it fell, as a rule, alternately in love with sheer volume and theatrical brand of quiet steadiness. Right now, volume was in order. "Teddy, God damn it, did you hear me?" Teddy turned around at the waist without changing the vigilant position of his feet on the Gladstone, and gave his father a look of inquiry, whole and pure. His eyes, which were pale brown in color and not at all large, were slightly crossed, the left eye more than the right. They were not crossed enough to be disfiguring or even necessarily noticeable at first glance. They were crossed just enough to be mentioned, and only in the context of the fact that one might have thought long and seriously before wishing them straighter, or deeper, or browner, or wider set. His face was just as it was, carried the impact, however oblique and slow-traveling, of real beauty. "I want you to get down off that bag now. How many times do I have to tell you?" Mr. McArdle said. "Stay exactly where you are, darling," said Miss McArdle, who evidently had a little trouble of her sinuses early in the morning. Her eyes were open, but only just. "Don't move with the tiniest part of an inch." She was lying on her right side, her face on the pillow, turned left toward Teddy in the porthole, her back to her husband. Her second sheet was drawn tight over her probably nude body, enclosing her, arms and all, up to the chin. "Jump up and down," she said, and closed her eyes. "Crush Daddy's bag." "That's a Jesus brilliant thing to say," Mr. McArdle said, steadily, addressing the back of his wife's head. "I pay £22 for a bag, and I ask the boy civilly not to stand on it, and you tell him to jump up and down on it? What's that supposed to be? Funny?" "If a bag can't support a 10-year-old boy who's 13 pounds underweight for his age, I don't want it in my cabin," Mrs. McArdle said, opening her eyes. "You know what I'd like to do?" Mr. McArdle said. "I'd like to kick your goddamn head open." "Why don't you?" Mr. McArdle abruptly propped himself up on one elbow and squashed out his cigarette stub on the glass top of the night table. "One of these days," he began grimly. "One of these days you're going to have a tragic, tragic heart attack," Mrs. McArdle said, with minimal energy. Without bringing her arms out into the open, she drew her top sheet more tightly and under her body. "There'll be a small, tasteless funeral, and everyone's going to ask who that attractive woman is in the red dress, sitting there in the first row, flirting with the organist and making a holy—" "You're so goddamn funny, it isn't even funny," Miss McArdle said, lying inertly on his back. During this little exchange, Teddy had faced around and resumed looking out the porthole. "We passed the Queen Mary at 3:32 this morning, going the other way, if anybody's interested," he said slowly. "Which I doubt." His voice was oddly and beautifully rough cut, as some small boys' voices are. Each of his phrasings was rather like a little ancient island, inundated by a miniature sea of whiskey. "That deck steward, Booper, despises, had it on his blackboard. I'll Queen Mary you, buddy, if you don't get off that bag this minute," his father said. He turned his head towards Teddy. "Get down from there now. Go get yourself a haircut or something." He looked at the back of his wife's head again. "He looks precocious, for God's sake." "I haven't any money," Teddy said. He placed his hands more securely on the sill of the porthole and lowered his chin onto the backs of his fingers. "Mother, you know that one man who sits next to us in the dining room? Not the very thin one, the other one, at the same table. Right next to where our waiter puts his tray down." "Mm-hmm," Miss McArdle said. "Teddy, darling, let your mother sleep just for 5 minutes more like a sweet boy." "Wait just a second, this is quite interesting," Teddy said, without raising his chin from his resting place, and without taking his eyes off the ocean. "He was in the gym a little while ago while Sven was weighing me. He came up and started talking to me. He heard that last tape I made, not the one in April, the one in May. He was at a party in Boston just before he went to Europe, and somebody at the party knew somebody in the Lydecker examining group, he didn't say who, and they borrowed that last tape I made and played it at the party. He seemed very interested in it. He's a friend of Professor Babcock's. Apparently he's a teacher himself. He said he was at Trinity College in Dublin all summer." "Oh?" said Mrs. McArdle. "At that party they played it?" She lay gazing sleepily at the backs of Teddy's legs. "I guess so," Teddy said. "He told Sven quite a bit about me, right while I was standing there. It was rather embarrassing." "Why should it be embarrassing?" Teddy hesitated. "I said rather embarrassing. I qualified it." "I'll qualify you, buddy, if you don't get the hell off that bag," Mrs. McArdle said. He had just lit a fresh cigarette. "I'm going to count to 3, goddammit. 1, goddammit. 2—" "What time is it?" Miss McArdle suddenly asked at the backs of Teddy's legs. Don't you and Booper have a swimming lesson at 10:30?" "We have time," Teddy said. Boom! He suddenly thrust his whole head out of the porthole, kept it there a few seconds, then brought it in just long enough to report. "Someone just dumped a whole garbage can of orange peels out the window." "Out the window? Out the window?" Mr. McArdle said sarcastically, flicking his ashes. "Out the porthole, buddy. Out the porthole." He glanced over at his wife. "Call Boston, quick. Get the Lydecker examining group on the phone." "Oh, you're such a brilliant wit," Miss McArdle said. "Why do you try?" Teddy took in most of his head. "They float very nicely," he said, without turning around. "That's interesting. Teddy, for the last time, I'm going to count to 3, then "I don't mean it's interesting in the way they float," Teddy said. "It's interesting that I know about them being there. If I hadn't seen them, then I wouldn't know they were there. And if I didn't know they were there, I wouldn't be able to say they even exist. That's a very nice, perfect example of the way—" "Teddy," Mrs. McArdle interrupted, without visibly stirring under her top sheet. "Go find Booper for me. Where is she? I don't want her lolling around that sun again today with that bum." "She's adequately covered. I made her wear her dungarees," Teddy said. "Some of them are starting to sink now. In a few minutes the only place they'll be still floating will be inside of my mind. That's quite interesting, because if you look at it in a certain way, That's where they started floating in the first place. If I'd never been standing here at all, or if somebody'd come along and sort of chopped my head off, right while I was. Where is she now? Mr. McCardle asked. Look at Mother a minute, Teddy. Teddy turned and looked at his mother. What? He said. Where's Booper now? I don't want her meandering around the deck chairs again, bothering people. If that awful man. She's all right, I gave her the camera. Mr. McCardle lurched forward on one arm. You gave her the camera? He said. What the hell's the idea? My goddamn Leica? I'm not going to have a 6-year-old child gallivanting all over. I showed her how to hold it so she won't drop it, Teddy said. And I took the film out naturally. I want that camera, Teddy, you hear me? I want you to get down off that bag this minute, and I want that camera back in this room in 5 minutes. There's going to be one little genius among the missing. Is that clear? Teddy turned his feet on the Gladstone and stepped down. He bent over and tied the lace on his left sneaker while his father, still raised up on one elbow, watched him like a monitor. Tell Hooper I want her, Mr. McCurdle said, and give Mother a kiss. Finished tying his sneaker lace, Teddy perfunctorily gave his mother a kiss on the cheek. She in turn brought her left arm out from under the sheet, as if bent on encircling Teddy's waist with it. But by the time she had gotten out from under, Teddy had moved on. He had come around the other side and entered the space between the two beds. He stooped and stood up with his father's pillow under his left arm and the glass ashtray that belonged on the night table in his right hand. Switching the ashtray over to his left hand, he went up to the night table and, with the edge of his right hand, swept his father's cigarette stubs and ashes onto the tray. Then, before putting the ashtray back where it belonged, he used the underside of his forearm to wipe off the filmy wake of ashes from the glass top of the table. He wiped off his forearm on his seersucker shorts. Then he placed the ashtray on the glass top with a world of care, as if he believed an ashtray should be dead centered on the surface of a night table, or not placed at all. At that point, his father, who had been watching him, abruptly gave up watching him. Don't you want your pillow? Teddy asked him. I want that camera, young man. You can't be very comfortable in that position. It isn't possible, Teddy said. I'll leave it right here. He placed the pillow on the foot of the bed, clear of his father's feet. He started out of the cabin. Teddy, his mother said, without turning over, tell Booper I want to see her before her swimming lesson today. Why don't you leave that kid alone? Mr. McCardle asked. You seem to resent her for having a few lousy minutes' freedom. You know how you treat her? I'll tell you exactly how you treat her. You treat her like a bloomin' criminal. Bloomin'? Oh, that's cute. You're getting so English, lover. Teddy lingered for a moment at the door, reflectively experimenting with the door handle, turning it slowly left and right. After I go out this door, I may only exist in the minds of all my acquaintances, he said. I may be an orange peel. What, darling? Mrs. McCardle asked him from across the cabin, still lying on her side. Let's get on the ball, buddy. Let's get that Leica down there. Come give Mother a kiss, a nice big one. Not right now, Teddy said absently. I'm tired. He closed the door behind him. The ship's daily newspaper lay outside the door sill. It was a single sheet of glossy paper with printing on just one side. Teddy picked it up and began to read it as he started slowly aft down the long passageway. On the opposite end, a huge blonde woman in starched white uniform was coming toward him, carrying a vase of long-stemmed red roses. As she passed Teddy, she put out her left hand and grazed the top of his head with it, saying, Somebody needs a haircut. Teddy passively looked up from his newspaper, but the woman had passed, and she didn't look back. He went on reading. At the end of the passageway before the enormous mural of St. George and the dragon over the staircase landing, he folded the ship's newspaper into quarters and put it into his left hip pocket. He then climbed broad, shallow, carpeted steps up to the main deck, one flight up. He took 2 steps at a time, but slowly holding on to the banister, putting his whole body into it, as if the act of climbing a flight of stairs was for him, as it was for many children, a moderately pleasurable end in itself. At the main deck landing, he went directly over to the purser's deck, where a good-looking girl in naval uniform was presiding at the moment. She was stapling some mimeographed sheets of paper together. Can you tell me what time that game starts today, please? Teddy asked her. I beg your pardon? Can you tell me what time that game starts today? The girl gave him a lipsticky smile. What game? She asked. You know, that word game they had yesterday and the day before, where you're supposed to supply the missing words. It's mostly that you have to put everything in context. The girl held off, fitting 3 sheets of paper between the planes of her stapler. Oh, she said, not till late afternoon, I believe. I believe it's around 4 o'clock. Isn't that a little over your head, dear? No, it isn't, thank you, Teddy said and started to take leave. Wait a minute. What's your name? Theodore McArdle, Teddy said. What's yours? My name, said the girl, smiling. My name's Ensign Mathewson. Teddy watched her press down her stapler. I knew you were an ensign, he said. I'm not sure, but I believe when somebody asks your name, you're supposed to say your whole name. Jane Mathewson or Phyllis Mathewson, and whatever the case may be. Oh, really? As I say, I think so. I'm not sure, though. It might be different if you're in the uniform. Anyway, thank you for the information. Goodbye. He turned and took the stairs up the promenade deck, again 2 at a time, but this time in a rather hurry. He found Booper after some extensive looking high up on the sports deck. She was in a sunny clearing, a glade, almost between 2 deck tennis courts that were in use. In a squatting position with the sun at her back and a light breeze riffling her silky blonde hair, she was busily piling 12 or 14 shuffleboard discs into 2 tangent stacks, one for the black discs and one for the red. A very small boy in a cotton sunsuit was standing close by on her right, purely in an observer's capacity. Look, Hooper said commandingly to her brother as he approached. She sprawled forward and surrounded the 2 stacks of shuffleboard discs with her arms, to show off her accomplishment, to isolate it from whatever else was aboard the ship. Myron, she said hostilely, addressing her companion, you're making it all shadowy so my brother can't see. Move your carcass. She shut her eyes and waited, with the cross-bearing grimace, till Myron moved. Teddy stood over the 2 stacks of discs and looked down appraisingly at them. That's very nice, he said. Very symmetrical. This guy, Booper said, indicating Myron. Never even heard of backgammon. They don't even have one. Teddy glanced briefly, objectively, at Myron. Listen, he said to Booper. Where's the camera? Daddy wants it right away. He doesn't even live in New York, Booper informed Teddy. And his father's dead. He was killed in Korea. She turned to Myron. Wasn't he? She demanded, but without waiting for a response. Now if his mother dies, he'll be an orphan. He didn't even know that. She looked at Myron. Did you? Myron, non-committal, folded his arms. You're the stupidest person I've ever met, Booper said to him. You're the stupidest person in this ocean. Did you know that? He's not, Teddy said. You're not, Myron. He addressed his sister. Give me your attention for a second. Where's the camera? I have to get it immediately. Where is it? Over there, Booper said, indicating no direction at all. She drew her 2 stacks of shuffleboard discs in closer to her. All I need now is 2 giants, she said. They could play backgammon until they got all tired, and then they could climb up on that smokestack and throw these at everybody and kill them. She looked at Myron. They could kill your parents, she said to him knowledgeably. And if that didn't kill them, you know what could do? You could put some poison on some marshmallows and make them eat it. The Leica was about 10 feet away, next to the white railing that surrounded the sports deck. It lay in the drain gullily on its side. Teddy went over and picked it up by its strap and hung it around his neck. Then immediately he took it off. He took it over to Booper. Booper, do me a favor. Take it down, please, he said. It's 10 o'clock. I have to write in my diary. I'm busy. Mom wants to see you right away anyway, Teddy said. You're a liar. I'm not a liar. She does, Teddy said. So please take this down with you when you go. Come on, Booper. What's she want to see me for? Booper demanded. I don't want to see her. She suddenly struck Myron's hand, which was in the act of picking off the top shuffleboard disc from the red stack. Hands off, she said. Teddy hung up the strap attached to the Leica around her neck. I'm serious now. Take this down to Daddy right away, and then I'll see you at the pool later on," he said. "I'll meet you right at the pool at 10:30, or right outside that place where you change your clothes. Be on time now. It's way down on E deck, don't forget, so leave yourself plenty of time." He turned and left. "I hate you. I hate everybody in this ocean," Hooper called after him. Deck on the broad after end of the sun deck, uncompromisingly al fresco, were some 75 or more deck chairs set up in a line 7 or 8 rows deep, with aisles just wide enough for the deck steward to use without unavoidably tripping over the sunning passengers' paraphernalia, knitting bags, dust-jacketed novels, bottles of suntan lotions, cameras. The area was crowded when Teddy arrived. He started at the rearmost row and moved methodically from row to row, stopping at each chair, whether or not it was occupied, to read the name on the placard of the arm. Only one or two of the reclining passengers spoke to him. That is, made any of the commonplace pleasantries adults are sometimes prone to make to a 10-year-old boy who is single-mindedly looking for the chair that belongs to him. His youngness and single-mindedness were obvious enough, but perhaps his general demeanor altogether lacked, or had too little of, that sort of cute solemnity that many adults readily speak up or down to. His clothes may have had something to do with it too. The hole in the shoulder of his t-shirt was not a cute hole. The excess material in the seat of his seersucker shorts, the excess length of the shorts themselves, were not cute excesses. The McCardles' 4-deck chairs, cushioned and ready for occupancy, were situated in the middle of the second row from the front. Teddy sat down in one of them, so, whether or not it was his intention, no one was sitting directly at either side of him. He stretched out his bare, unsuntanned legs, feet together on the leg rest, and almost simultaneously took a small 10-cent notebook out of his right hip pocket. Then, instantly, one-pointed concentration, as if only he and the notebook existed. No sunshine, no fellow passengers, no ship, he began to turn the pages. With the exception of a very few pencil notations, the entries in the notebook had apparently been made with a ballpoint pen. The handwriting itself was manuscript style, that was such is currently being taught in American schools, instead of the old Palmer method. It was legible without being pretty. The flow was what was remarkable about the handwriting. In no sense, no mechanical sense at any rate, did the words and sentences look as though they were written by a child. Teddy gave considerable reading time to what looked like his most recent entry. It covered a little more than 3 pages. Diary for October 27th, 1952, property of Theodore McArdle, 412 A deck. Appropriate and pleasant reward if finder promptly returns to Theodore McArdle. See if you can find Daddy's Army dog tags, and wear them whenever possible. It won't kill you, and he will like it. Answer Professor Mandel's letter when you get a chance, and the patient's. Ask him not to send any more poetry books. I already have enough for 1 year anyways. I'm quite sick of it anyway. A man walks along the beach and unfortunately gets hit in the head by a coconut. His head unfortunately cracks open in 2 halves. Then his wife comes along the beach singing a song and sees the 2 halves and recognizes them and picks them up. She gets very sad, of course, and cries heartbreakingly. That is exactly why I'm tired of poetry. Supposing the lady just picks up the 2 halves and shouts into them very angrily, "Stop that." Do not mention this when you answer his letter, however. It is quite controversial, and Mrs. Mandel is a poet besides. Get Sven's address in Elizabeth, New Jersey. It could be interesting to meet his wife, also his dog Lindy. However, I would like to not own a dog myself. Write a condolence letter to Dr. Wakawara about his nephritis. Get his new address for Mother. Try the sports deck for meditation tomorrow morning before breakfast, but do not lose consciousness. Also, do not lose consciousness in the dining room if that waiter drops that big spoon again. Daddy was quite furious. Words and expressions to look up in the library tomorrow when you return the books. Triumvirate, cunning, gift horse, myriad, and nephritis. Be nicer to librarian. Discuss some general things with him when he gets kittenish. Teddy abruptly took out a small bullet-shaped ballpoint pen from the side pocket of his shorts, uncapped it, and began to write. He used his right thigh as a desk instead of the armchair. Diary for October 28th, 1952. Same address and reward as written on October 26th and 27th, 1952. I wrote letters to the following persons after meditation this morning: Dr. Wakawara, Professor Mandel, Professor Pete, Burgess Hack Jr., Roberta Hack, Sanford Hack, Grandma Hack, Mr. Graham, and Professor Walton. I could have asked Mother where Daddy's dog tags are, but she would probably say I don't have to wear them. I know he has them with him because I saw him pack them. Life is a gift horse, in my opinion. I think it is very tasteless of Professor Walton to criticize my parents. He wants people to be a certain way. It will either happen today or February 14th, 1955, when I am 16. It is ridiculous to mention even. After making this last entry, Teddy continued to keep his attention on the page of his ballpoint pen poised, as though there were more to come. He was apparently unaware that he had a lone interested observer. About 15 forward shift from the first row of the deck chairs, and 18 or 20 rather sun-blinding feet overhead, a young man was steadily watching him from the sports deck railing. This had been going on for some 10 minutes. It was evident that the young man was now reaching some sort of decision, for he abruptly took his foot down from the railing. He stood for a moment still looking in Teddy's direction, then walked away out of sight. Not a minute later, though, he turned up obtrusively vertical among the deck chair ranks. He was about 30 or younger. He directly started to make his way down aisle towards Teddy's chair, casting distracting little shadows over the pages of people's novels, and stepping rather uninhibitedly, considering that this was his only standing, moving figure in sight, over knitting bags and other personal affects. Teddy seemed oblivious of the fact that someone was standing at the foot of his chair, or, for that matter, casting a shadow over his notebook. A few people in the row or two behind him, however, were more distractible. They looked up at the young man as, perhaps, only people in deck chairs can look up at someone. The young man had a kind of poise about him, though, that looked as though it might hold up indefinitely, with that very small proviso that he kept at least one hand in his pocket. "Hello there," he said to Teddy. Teddy looked up. "Hello?" he said. He partly closed his notebook, partly let it close by itself. "Mind if I sit down a minute?" the man asked, with what seemed to be unlimited cordiality. "This anybody's chair?" "Well, these 4 chairs belong to my family," Teddy said, "but my parents aren't up yet." "Not up? On a day like this?" the young man said. He already had lowered himself onto the chair at Teddy's sight. The chairs were placed so close together that the arms touched. "That's sacrilege," he said. "Absolute sacrilege." He stretched out his legs, which were unusually heavy at the thighs, almost like human bodies in themselves. He was dressed for the most part in Eastern Seaboard regimentals, a turf haircut on top, run-down brogues at the bottom, with a somewhat mixed uniform in between, buff-colored woolen socks, charcoal-gray trousers, a button-down collared shirt, no necktie, and a herringbone jacket that looked as though it had been properly aged in some of the more popular postgraduate seminars at Yale or Harvard or Princeton. "Oh God, what a divine day," he said appreciatively, squinting up at the sun. "I'm an absolute pawn when it comes to the weather." He crossed his heavy legs at the ankles. "As a matter of fact, I've been known to take a perfectly normal rainy day as a personal insult. So this is absolute manna to me." Though his speaking voice was, in the usual connotation, well-bred, it carried considerably more adequately, as though he had some sort of understanding with himself, that anything he had to say would sound pretty much all right, intelligent, literate, even amusing or stimulating, either that or from Teddy's vantage point, or from that of the people in the row behind, if they were listening. He looked obliquely down at Teddy and smiled. "How are you in the weather?" he asked. His smile was not unpersonable, but it was social or conversational and related back, however indirectly, to his own ego. "The weather ever bother you out of all sensible portion?" he asked, smiling. "I don't take it too personal, if that's what you mean," Teddy said. The young man laughed, letting his head go back. "Wonderful," he said. "My name, incidentally, is Bob Nicholson. I don't know if we quite got around to that in the gym. I know your name, of course." Teddy shifted his weight over to one hip and stashed his notebook in the side pocket of his shorts. I was watching you write from way up there, Nicholson said, narratively pointing. Good Lord, you are working away like a little Trojan. Teddy looked at him. I was writing something in my notebook. Nicholson nodded, smiling. How was Europe? He asked conversationally. Did you enjoy it? Yes, very much, thank you. Where did you all go? Teddy suddenly reached forward and scratched the calf of his leg. Well, it would take me too much time to name all the places, because we took our car and drove fairly great distances. He sat back. My mother and I were mostly in Edinburgh, Scotland, and Oxford in England, though. I think I told you in the gym I had to be interviewed at both of those places, mostly at the University of Edinburgh. No, I don't believe you did, Nicholson said. I was wondering if you had done anything like that. How'd it go? They grill you? I beg your pardon? Teddy said. How'd it go? Was it interesting? At times yes, at times no, Teddy said. We stayed a little bit too long. My father wanted to get back to New York a little sooner than this ship, but some people were coming over from Stockholm, Sweden, Innsbruck, Austria to meet me, and we had to wait around. It's always that way. Teddy looked at him directly for the first time. Are you a poet? He asked. A poet, Nicholson said. Lord, no. Alas, no. Why do you ask? I don't know. Poets are always taking the weather so personally. They're always sticking their emotions in things that have no emotions. Nicholson, smiling, reached into his jacket pocket and took out a cigarette and matches. I'd rather thought that was the stock in the trade, he said. Aren't emotions what poets are primarily concerned with? Teddy apparently didn't hear him or wasn't listening. He was looking abstractly toward or over the twin smokestacks on the sports deck. Nicholson got his cigarette lit with some difficulty, for there was a light breeze blowing from the north. He sat back and said, I understand you left a pretty disturbed bunch. Nothing in the voice of the cicada imitates how soon it will die, Teddy said suddenly. Along this road goes no one this autumn eve. What was that? Nicholson asked, smiling. Say that again? Those are two Japanese poems. They're not full of a lot of emotional stuff, Teddy said. He sat forward abruptly, tilted his head to the right, and gave his right ear a slight clap of his hand. I still have some water in my ear from swimming lessons yesterday, he said. He gave his ear another couple claps, then sat back, putting his arms on both the armrests. It was, of course, a normal adult-sized deck chair, and he looked distinctly small in it, but at the same time he looked perfectly relaxed, even serene. I understand you left a pretty disturbed bunch of pendants up at Boston, Nicholson said, watching him. After that last little set, too. The whole Lydecker examining group, more or less, the way I understand it. I believe I told you I had a rather long chat with L. Bagpop last June. Same night, as a matter of fact. I heard your tape played off. Yes, you did, you told me. I understand they're a pretty disturbed bunch, Nicholson pressed. From what Al told me, you had quite a little lethal bull session late one night, the same night you made that tape, I believe. He took a drag on his cigarette. From what I gather, you had made some little predictions that disturbed the boys to no end. Is that right? I wish I knew why people think it's so important to be emotional, Teddy said. My mother and father don't think a person's human unless he thinks a lot of things are very sad or very annoying or very, very unjust, sort of. My father gets very emotional even when he reads the newspaper. He thinks I'm inhuman. Nicholson flicked his cigarette ash off to one side. I take it you have no emotions? He said. Teddy reflected before answering. If I do, I don't remember when I ever used them, he said. I don't see what they're good for. You love God, don't you? Nicholson asked, with a little excess of quietness. Isn't that your forte, so to speak? From what I heard on that tape, and from what Al Babcock, yeah, sure, I love him, but I don't love him sentimentally. He never said anybody had to love him sentimentally, Teddy said. If I were God, I certainly wouldn't want people to love me sentimentally. It's too unreliable. You love your parents, don't you? Yes, I do, very much, Teddy said. But you want to make me use that word to mean what you want it to mean, I can tell. All right. In what sense do you want to use it? Teddy thought it over. You know what the word affinity means? He asked, turning over to Nicholson. I have a rough idea, Nicholson said dryly. I have a very strong affinity for them. They're my parents, I mean, and we're all part of each other's harmony and everything, Teddy said. I want them to have a nice time while they're alive, because they like having a nice time. But they don't love me, and Booper, that's my sister, that way. I mean, they don't seem to be able to love us just the way we are. They don't seem to be able to love us unless they can keep changing us a little bit. They love their reasons for loving us almost as much as they love us, and the most of the time more. It's not so good that way. He turned toward Nicholson again, sitting slightly forward. Do you have the time, please? He asked. I have a swimming lesson at 10:30. You have time, Nicholson said, without first looking at his wristwatch. He pushed back his cuff. It's just 10 after 10, he said. Thank you, Teddy said, and sat back. We can enjoy our conversation for about 10 more minutes. Nicholson let one leg drop over the side of the deck chair, leaned forward, and stepped on his cigarette end. As I understand it, he said, sitting back, you hold pretty firmly to the Vedantic theory of reincarnation. Isn't it a theory as much as it's part of... All right, Nicholson said quickly. He smiled and gently raised the flats of his hands, in a sort of ironic benediction. We won't argue that point for the moment. Let me finish. He crossed his heavy, outstretched legs again. From what I gather, you've acquired certain information through meditation that's given you some sort of conviction that in your last incarnation you were a holy man in India, but more so less fell from grace. I wasn't a holy man, Teddy said. I was just a person making a very nice spiritual advancement. All right, whatever it was, Nicholson said. But the point is, you feel that your last incarnation, you more so less fell from grace before final illumination. Is that right, or am I? That's right, Teddy said. I met a lady, and I sort of stopped meditating. He took his arms down from the armrest and tucked his hands as if to keep them warm under his thighs. I would have had to take another body and come back to Earth again anyway. I mean, I wasn't so spiritually advanced that I could have died if I hadn't met that lady and then gone straight to Brahma and never again have to come back to Earth. But I wouldn't have had to get incarnated in an American body if I hadn't met that lady. I mean, it's very hard to meditate and live a spiritual life in America. People think you're a freak if you try to. My father thinks I'm a freak in a way. My mother, well, she doesn't think it's so good for me to think about God all the time. She thinks it's bad for my health. Nicholson was looking at him, studying him. I believe you said on that last tape you were 6 when you first had a mystical experience. Is that right? I was 6 when I saw that everything was God, and my hair stood up, and all that, Teddy said. It was on a Sunday, I remember. My sister was only a very tiny child then, and she was drinking her milk, and all of a sudden I saw that she was God and the milk was God. I mean, all she was doing was pouring God into God, if you know what I mean. Nicholson didn't say anything. But I could get out of the finite dimensions very often when I was 4, Teddy said, as an afterthought. Not continuously or anything, but fairly often. Nicholson nodded. You did, he said. You could? Yes, Teddy said. That was on the tape. Or maybe it was on the one I made last April. I'm not sure. Nicholson took out his cigarettes again, but without taking his eyes off Teddy. How does one get out of the finite dimensions? He asked, and gave a short laugh. I mean, to begin, very basically, a block of wood is a block of wood if, for example, it has length, width. It hasn't. That's where you're wrong, Teddy said. Everybody just thinks things keep stopping off somewhere. They don't. That's what I was trying to tell Professor Pete. He shifted in his seat and took out an eyesore of a handkerchief, a gray wadded entity, and blew his nose. The reason things seem to stop off somewhere is because that's the way most people know how to look at things, he said. But that doesn't mean they do. He put away his handkerchief and looked at Nicholson. Would you hold up your arm for a second, please? He asked. My arm? Why? Just do it. Just do it a second. Nicholson raised his forearm an inch or two above the level of the armrest. This one? He asked. Teddy nodded. What do you call that? He asked. What do you mean? It's my arm. It's an arm. How do you know it is? Teddy asked. You know it's called an arm, but how do you know it is one? Do you have any proof that it is an arm? Nicholson took out his cigarette out of his pack and lit it. I think that smacks one of the worst kind of sophistry, frankly, he said, exhaling smoke. It's an arm, for heaven's sake. because it's an arm. In the first place, it has a name to distinguish it from other objects. I mean, you can't simply. You're just being logical, Teddy said impassively. I'm just being what? Nicholson said, with a little excess of politeness. Logical. You're just giving me a regular, intelligent answer, Teddy said. I was trying to help you. You asked me how I get out of the finite dimensions when I feel like it. I certainly don't use logic when I do it. Logic's the first thing you have to get rid of. Nicholson removed a flake of tobacco from his tongue to his fingers. Do you know Adam? Teddy asked him. Do I know who? Adam in the Bible. Nicholson smiled. Not personally, he said dryly. Teddy hesitated. Don't be angry with me, he said. You asked me a question and I'm not angry with you, for heaven's sake. Okay, Teddy said. He was sitting back in his chair, but his head was turned toward Nicholson. You know that apple Adam ate in the Garden of Eden, referred to in the Bible, he asked. You know what was in that apple? Logic. Logic and intellectual stuff. That was all that was in it. So this is my point. What you have to do is vomit it up if you want to see things as they really are. I mean, if you vomit it up, then you won't have any more trouble with the blocks of wood and stuff. You won't see everything stopping off all the time. And you'll know what your arm really is, if you're interested. Do you know what I mean? Do you follow me? I follow you, Nicholson said, rather shortly. The trouble is, Teddy said, most people don't want to see things as they really are. They don't even want to stop getting born and dying all the time. They just want new bodies all the time, instead of stopping and staying with God, where it's really nice, he reflected. I never saw such a bunch of apple eaters, he said. He shook his head. At that moment, a white-coated deck steward, who was making his rounds with the area, stopped in front of Teddy and Nicholson and asked them if they would care to have a morning broth. Nicholson didn't respond to the question at all. Teddy said, "No, thank you," and the deck steward passed them by. "If you'd rather not discuss this, you don't have to," Nicholson said abruptly and rather burlesquely. He flicked his cigarette ash. "But is it true, or isn't it, that you informed the whole Lydecker examining bunch, Walton, Pete, Larson, Samuels, and that bunch, when and where and how they would eventually die? Is that true, or isn't it? You don't have to discuss it if you don't want to. But the way the rumor around Boston—" "No, it is not true," Teddy said with emphasis. "I told them places and times, and when they should be very, very careful. And I told them certain things it might be a good idea for them to do. But I didn't say anything like that. I didn't say anything was inevitable that way." He took out his handkerchief again and used it. Nicholson waited, watching him. "And I didn't tell Professor Pete anything like that at all. Firstly, he wasn't one of the ones who were kidding around and asking me a bunch of questions. I mean, all I told Professor Pete was that he shouldn't be a teacher anymore after January. That's all I told him." Teddy, sitting back, was silent a moment. "All those other professors, they practically forced me to tell them all that stuff. It was after we were all finished with the interview and making that tape, and it was quite late, and they all kept sitting around smoking cigarettes and getting very kittenish." "But you didn't tell Walton or Larson, for example, when or where or how death would eventually come?" Nicholson pressed. "No, I did not," Teddy said firmly. "I wouldn't have told them any of that stuff, but they kept talking about it. Professor Walton sort of started it. He said he really wished he knew when he was going to die, because then he'd know what work he should do and what work he shouldn't do, and how to use his time to his best advantage, and all like that. And they all said that, so I told them a little bit." Nicholson didn't say anything. "I didn't tell them when they were actually going to die, though. That's a very false rumor," Teddy said. "I could have, but I knew that in their hearts they really didn't want to know. I mean, I knew that even though they teach religion and philosophy and all, they're still pretty afraid to die." Teddy sat, or reclined, in a silence for a minute. "It's so silly," he said. "All you do is get the heck out of your body when you die. My gosh, everybody's gone and done it thousands and thousands of times. Just because they don't remember it doesn't mean they haven't done it. It's so silly." That may be," Nicholson said. But the logical fact remains that no matter how intelligently— It's so silly, Teddy said again. For example, I have a swimming lesson in about 5 minutes. I could go downstairs to the pool, and there might not be any water in it. This might be the day they change the water or something. That might happen, though. I might walk into the edge of it, just to have a look at the bottom, for instance, and my sister might come up and sort of push me in. I could fracture my skull and die instantaneously. Teddy looked at Nicholson. That could happen, he said. My sister's only 6, and she hasn't been a human being for very many lives, and she doesn't like me very much. That could happen, all right. What would be so tragic about it, though? What's there to be afraid of, I mean? I'd just be doing what I was supposed to do. That's all, wouldn't I? Nicholson snorted mildly. It might not be a tragedy from your point of view. It would certainly be a sad event for your mother and dad, he said. Ever consider that? Yes, of course, I have, Teddy said. But that's only because they have names and emotions for everything that happens. He had been keeping his hands tucked under his legs again. He took them out now, put his arms up on the armrest, and looked at Nicholson. You know Sven, that guy who takes care of the gym? He asked. He waited till he got a nod from Nicholson. Well, if Sven dreamed tonight that his dog died, he'd have a very, very bad night's sleep, because he's very fond of that dog. But when he woke up in the morning, everything would be all right. He'd know it was only a dream. Nicholson nodded. What's the point exactly? The point is, if his dog really died, it would be the exact same thing, only he wouldn't know it. I mean, he wouldn't wake up till he died himself. Nicholson looked detached, was using his right hand to give him a slow, sensuous massage at the back of his neck. He left his hand mostly on the armrest, with a fresh, unlit cigarette between his fingers, looked oddly white and inorganic in a brilliant sunlight. Teddy suddenly got up. I really have to go now, I'm afraid, he said. He sat down tentatively on the extended leg attachment of his chair, facing Nicholson, and tucked in his t-shirt. I have about 1.5 minutes, I guess, to go to my swimming lesson, he said. It's all the way down on E deck. May I ask you why you told Professor Pete he should stop teaching after the first of the year? Nicholson asked, rather bluntly. I know about Pete, that's why I asked. Teddy tightened his alligator belt only because he's quite spiritual, and he's teaching a lot of stuff right now that isn't very good for him if he wants to make any real spiritual advancement. It stimulates him too much. It's time for him to take everything out of his head instead of putting more stuff in. He could get rid of a lot of the apple in just this one life if he wanted to. He's very good at meditating. Teddy got up. I better go now. I don't want to be too late. Nicholson looked up at him and sustained the look detaining him. What would you do if you could change the educational system? He asked ambiguously. Ever think about that at all? I really have to go, Teddy said. Just answer that one question, Nicholson said. Education's my baby, actually. That's what I teach. That's why I ask. Well, I'm not too sure what I'd do, Teddy said. I'm pretty sure I wouldn't start with the things schools usually start with. He folded his arms and reflected briefly. I think I'd first just assemble all the children together and show them how to meditate. I'd try to show them how to find out who they are, not just what their names are and things like that. I guess, even before that, I'd get them to empty out everything their parents and everybody ever told them. I mean, even if their parents just told them an elephant's big, I'd make them empty that out. An elephant's only big when it's next to something else, a dog or a lady, for example. Teddy thought another moment. I wouldn't even tell them an elephant has a trunk. I might show them an elephant if I had one handy, but I'd let them just walk up to the elephant not knowing anything more about it than the elephant knew about them. The same thing with grass and other things. I wouldn't even tell them grass is green. Colors are only names. I mean, if you tell them the grass is green, it makes them start expecting the grass to look a certain way, your way, instead of some other way that might be just as good and maybe much better. I don't know. I'd just make them vomit up every bit of apple their parents and everybody made them take a bite out of. There's no risk you'd be raising up a little generation of ignoramuses. Why, they wouldn't be any more ignoramuses than the elephant is, or a bird is, or a tree is, Teddy said. Just because something is a certain way instead of just behaves a certain way doesn't mean it's an ignoramus. No? No, Teddy said. Besides, if they wanted to learn all that other stuff, names and colors and things, they could do it, if they felt like it, later on when they're older. But I'd want them to begin with all the real ways of looking at things, not just the way the other apple eaters look at things. That's what I mean. He came closer to Nicholson and extended his hand down to him. I have to go now. Honestly, I've enjoyed. Just 1 second, sit down a minute, Nicholson said. Ever think you might like to do something in research when you grow up? Medical research or something of that kind? It seems to me, with your mind, you might eventually. Teddy answered, but without sitting down. I thought about that once, a couple years ago, he said. I've talked to quite a few doctors, he shook his head. That wouldn't interest me very much. Doctors stay too right on the surface. They're always talking about cells and things. Oh, you don't attach any importance to cell structure? Yeah, sure I do, but doctors talk about cells as if they had such unlimited importance all by themselves. As if they didn't really belong to the person who has them. Teddy brushed back his hair from his forehead with one hand. I grew my own body, he said. Nobody else did it for me. So if I grew it, I must have known how to grow it, unconsciously at least. I may have lost the conscious knowledge of how to grow it sometime in the last few hundred thousands of years, but the knowledge is still there, because obviously I've used it. It would take quite a lot of meditation and emptying out to get the whole thing back, I mean the conscious knowledge, but you could do it if you wanted to, if you opened up wide enough. He suddenly reached down and picked up Nicholson's right hand on the armrest. He shook it just once, cordially, and said, Goodbye, I have to go. And at this time Nicholson wasn't able to detain him. He started so quickly to make his way through the aisle. Nicholson sat motionless for some few minutes after he left, his hands on the armrests of the chair, his unlighted cigarette still between the fingers of his left hand. Finally, he raised his right hand and used it as if to check whether his collar was still open. Then he lit his cigarette and sat quite still again. He smoked the cigarette down to its end, then abruptly let one foot over the side of the chair, stepped on the cigarette, got to his feet, and made his way rather quickly out of the aisle. Using the forward-ship stairway, he descended fairly briskly to the promenade deck, without stopping here or there. He continued down, still quite rapidly, to main deck, then to A deck, then to B deck, then to C deck, then to D deck. At D deck, the forward-ship stairway ended, and Nicholson stood for a moment, apparently at loss for some direction. However, he spotted someone who looked able to guide him. Halfway down the passageway, a stewardess was standing on the chair outside the gallery, reading a magazine and smoking a cigarette. Nicholson went down to her, consulted her briefly, thanked her, then took a few additional steps forward-ship and opened a heavy metal door that read to the pool. It opened to a narrow, uncarpeted staircase. He was little more than halfway down the staircase when he heard an all-piercing, sustained scream, clearly coming from a small female child. It was highly acoustical, as though it were reverberating within the four tiled walls. And that, ladies and gentlemen, concludes this recording of Teddy, a short story featured in J.D. Salinger's publication of the 9 stories. My name is Max, and apologies if I had botched any words or fallen flat. This is my first audiobook recording on this channel. I hope to do it more in the near future. Overall, I've been a Salinger follower for quite some time, interacting with his works, such as A Perfect Day for Banana Fish, Teddy for Esme with Love and Squalor, short stories, his combined novella, Franny and Zoe, and his American renowned classic, of course, The Catcher in the Rye. I pay a lot of respects to this man and his work as I feel he's kind of springboarded me to explore sipping from more of the cups of the bittersweet themes of psychology and existentialism as a teenager once I've kind of passed up my angsty phase, which also led me down the amazing rabbit hole to the genre of absurdism as well, which arose during war times. And I feel these genres will not really cease to grow old despite the age and could be used in more stories today as well. Um, in the plot of Teddy, we followed a 10-year-old prophet boy who is both disconnected and heavily connected to his surroundings as he believes in the Vedantic theory of reincarnation. He's a rather intelligent child, and he enlightens a man on his viewpoints, beliefs, as he believes he has been reincarnated many times, to which he is aware of in his existence, as everyone else. The last time as a spiritually advanced man in India, this time as an American boy, a setback as he's not reached final elimination, possibly due to temptation, karma in his past life, unable to move away from the finite dimensions onto the infinite dimension. I've done a little research on the Vedantic theory for this video out of curiosity of this philosophy, and I believe what he may be referring to is the concept of reaching liberation. According to a website called the Vedanta Society of Southern California, Vedanta is an ancient spiritual philosophy rooted in Hinduism. It affirms the oneness of self, the divinity of the soul, and the harmony of all religions. As stated in the article, Vedanta is a combination of two words, Veda, meaning knowledge, and Anta, which means the end of or the goal of. In this context, the goal of knowledge isn't exactly intellectual, the limited knowledge that we require or acquire by doing things such as reading books, but knowledge here kind of means the knowledge of God, the divine, or the universe, whatever you'd like to call it, as well as the knowledge of our own divine nature. Vedanta, then, is a search for self knowledge as well as a search for divinity. God, from this viewpoint, being infinite existence, infinite consciousness, and infinite bliss. Remember, people just keep going around and wanting to be dying and being born again all the time in infinite dimensions. The term for the transcendent kind of reality is called Brahman. Apologies if I had mispronounced this in the beginning. And Vedanta, the divine ground of being. Yet Vedanta also maintains that God can be personal as well, assuming human form in every age. But most importantly, the divine spirit dwells within our own hearts as the divine self or the Atman. The Atman in Vedanta is never born, nor will it die, such as Teddy states. The self will always exist, reaching liberation or not. Vedanta asserts that the goal of life is to realize and to manifest our own individual divinity. This divinity is our real nature and the realization of it as our birthright. We are moving towards this goal as we grow with knowledge and life experiences, the soul experience, not just the book knowledge or, how he had talked about medical exploration of cells, the human body, but the soul experience overall, or not exactly what the other apple eaters see as knowledge, but what's around you, as we're not quite thoroughly engaged with that as a soul level or with our self or the power of our own divine being without that pressing quest for logic, knowledge, meaning. Emotions as well, not being our driver either, but simply overall it is just about being. That is at least my interpretation of Vedanta. According to the article as well, it is inevitable that we will eventually, either in this or in future lives, discover that the greatest truth of our existence is our own divine nature, and human suffering is one of the religion's most compelling mysteries, and Vedanta doesn't blame the divine or the god, or a god, for the problems of the world and places. It firmly places that in our own court when it comes to that of our logic, our feelings, our definitions, our actions. Nothing happens to us by the whim of some outside source. We ourselves are responsible for what life brings us. There's God in all of us, as we are reaping the results of our own previous actions in this life and previous lives. Although karma means action, it also means the result of action. Whatever acts we have performed and whatever thoughts we have thought have created a certain impression both in our minds and in the universe around us in this theory. The universe gives back to us what we have given to it. Good actions and thoughts create good effects, bad ones create bad effects, at least in Vedanta. Whenever we perform any action, whenever we think any thought, an imprint is made upon the mind in this theory. Sometimes we are conscious of this imprinting process just as often as we are not. When actions and thoughts are repeated, the grooves become deeper in our minds. The combination of this creates our individual characters and also strongly influences our subsequent thoughts and actions. If we anger easily, for example, like Teddy mentions with his parents in the short story, we create an angry mind that is predisposed to react with anger rather than patience or understanding, which exists within the quiet of our being. Our thoughts and our actions aren't so much as arrows as they are boomerangs. Eventually, they find their way back home. In Vedanta, the effects of karma may come instantly later in life or in another life altogether, but what's certain is that they will appear at some time or another. Until liberation's kind of achieved, we live and we die within the confines of the law of karma again and again, going around living and dying all the time in the chain of cause and effect. If we haven't attained liberation with the self, when we die, according to the article, the only death is that of our physical body, which Teddy thinks is silly to be afraid of, considered we've died so many times with or without our recollection of it. He asks, why are we so afraid of something we've done for so long, like the back of our hands? That, from this viewpoint, which you could also take as everyone dies every day, so why fear it? It's a fact of life you can't change. The philosophers, teachers he's spoken with, that being their realm of study, still being a fear for them despite it being out of their control, because such as the one professor believes he hopes he could have done enough before dying, and that's why he wants to know from Teddy when he would die. Teddy's non-worry is conclusive to knowing the professor and he will live again in another body, and it's another component of people not accepting things for what they are, at least to him. When the person is reborn, reincarnated, the birth is that of a new physical body accompanied by the old mind with the impressions from the previous lives. When we attain God realization or self realization, liberation, the law of karma is overall transcended. The self gives up its identification with the body and mind and regains its native freedom and bliss. Now that I've touched on Vedanta, I would like to state that this is just Salinger's viewpoint on life and religion, the universe. I myself or you could have a similar yet completely different viewpoint, beliefs of our own. As I've said, I've consumed a decent bit of existential stories. I find myself I am often caught between journeying, or just observing life at its base or its core, being mindful of what's actually around me, as books have the potential danger to be persuasive to cling on to a certain viewpoint. I found myself traveling the realm of more pessimistic stories until recently, which kind of perpetuated. Shout out to Better Than Food YouTuber for adding this to my vocabulary, but my morose viewpoints. It's taught me the danger of attachment and the enlightenment of overall detachment. I've always been an open individual, but sometimes you can just be entrapped no matter how open you are, especially when you believe a certain belief, and a story is validating that. It's kind of an echo chamber in that way, which closes you off to other views, which wasn't the initial intention, at least for myself. It's purely possible to view works objectively, and consuming dark literature has ironically allowed me to do just that. Maybe not eat the apple, but observe the apple, like Teddy in that way. It's interesting. It's kind of interesting to imagine a world where you're fostered to maybe learn language, your basic human functions, but not pushed to think or feel a certain way by parental figures, or at least initially, or presented with many options, or finding them yourselves rather than one direction, whether that's with the masses or not. I wonder what life would look like for a child then. It's interesting to ponder the clean slated mind before it evolves. Overall, myself, I like to leave room for ands in life and not either's and ors. As to me, nothing and everything matters. I'm a bit spiritual as well, so I can semi identify with the text, but actually quite a bit differently. With Salinger, he has his own explorative style of taking children and building them up to be these intellectual giants or just forms of pure innocence in his stories. Their knowledge is beyond the capacity from that you could exhibit from an average child, or it kind of involves their base way of viewing things, before all the apples come in. The other stuff they can find beyond the apples they're fed. He tends to explore the themes of childlike innocence, observance, purity, comparative to that of the adult mindsets that have developed overall. I was an observant child myself, and it seems our eyes and heart may be a bit more open and analytical before certain beliefs or directions are implanted into us, but I don't think I'd change any part of my story to gain that original purity back. But I think I could, in my own way, benefit from once again observing while I explore. Um, this story was quite a bit interesting to me because it allowed me to gain a potentially broader understanding or interpretation of why Salinger could insert intelligence onto children or his adolescent characters given his religious affiliation. Although he sways in all different directions, with Teddy he has a childlike observance and an adult-like accumulation of wisdom from past lives, coming to the conclusion that in order to spiritually ascend, he needs to connect with his divine self and live in the world of God as it is. And Holden, in The Catcher in the Rye, feels the same way that adults implant, project their own beliefs and narratives onto children and their stories, as he's kind of been the Peter Pan figure in that way. He wants to protect children from growing up or being pushed to move in a certain direction, following the masses. Well, his mind also himself kind of runs rampant, which is an irony in itself. In Franny and Zoe, the two teen prodigies, siblings have a tabletop argument on the meaning of life and ego. They go rounds with each other to come to the deduction that if they're so bent on a search for meaning, God is in everything, even the fat lady that's out on the stage. For Franny is God. She's an actor, and again, accepting the world at its base. If there has to be something to keep going for or doing it for overall, why not do it for the fat lady, as silly as that sounds, which kind of sings to me radical acceptance and energy conservation, not, you know, you can get stuck in that loophole of uh, diving too deep. But I know now that it has a connection to Salinger's spiritual background. In For Esme with Love and Squalor, sympathy is kind of exhibited from the innocent during wartime, which is another aspect of Salinger's stories, as he served in World War II, which is a whole other discussion given the components of the story, such as A Perfect Day for Banana Fish, which explores childlike innocence over the lenses of those who have endured the war and wartime PTSD and the aftermath, and the inability for the soldiers overall to view the world in the same way. Overall, this story was quite interesting to me, and let me know in the comments what you think. To the random stranger who is probably listening to this, I again will be recording other stories and may make commentaries on them, likely shorter than this one as I've gone off on a great tangent. I'm a Salinger follower. Let me know if I messed anything up on my research and let me know your thoughts on Teddy. I'd love to hear them.